The Pacific Ocean, vast, endless, seemingly untouchable. For years, the United States believed it was shielded by distance, protected by the waters between continents. But in the east, Japan's empire was rising. Ambition grew larger than borders. Hunger for resources became stronger than diplomacy. And behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would change the century. December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. A morning that began with music, routine, and peace, and ended in fire, smoke, and blood. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy." The strike on Pearl Harbor was not only a surprise attack, it was a message to the world. A message written in flames across the Pacific sky. That war had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. This is the story of why Japan decided to strike, how the plan was born in secrecy, how it was carried out with precision, and how it ignited a war that spanned the globe. Pearl Harbor. Why Japan decided to strike, and how it ignited the war. In the late 1930s, Japan stood trapped between ambition and desperation. Its empire extended over Korea, Manchuria, and deep into China. Yet its hunger for resources only grew. Oil, steel, and rubber, the very lifelines of modern war, were scarce within the home islands. Without them, ships would rust in harbors, planes would stay grounded, and factories would go silent. The United States, disturbed by Japanese expansion in Asia, tightened its grip steadily. Trade restrictions increased. Japanese assets were frozen. And in July 1941, the oil embargo hit Tokyo like a thunderclap. Diplomatic negotiations dragged on. But inside Tokyo's war councils, whispers became storms. Top-secret records of the Imperial Conference, declassified years later, revealed the fear of collapse. Japanese military planners said, "If we do not seize the resources of the South, our empire will collapse within 2 years." The choice was brutal. Either submit to American demands, abandon expansion, and accept humiliation, or strike boldly, capture the oil fields of Southeast Asia, and cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could interfere. At the center of these debates stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. He had studied in the United States. He knew America's vast industrial strength. Yet he believed in the power of one decisive strike. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto said, "In the first 6 months of war with the United States, I will run wild, scoring victory after victory. But after that, I have no confidence." Classified Navy files, locked away for decades, showed Yamamoto's warnings in clear terms. He insisted Japan must strike first, or be strangled by America's unmatched production capacity. The Imperial General Headquarters argued endlessly. Some favored patience, diplomacy, compromise. Others demanded action, pointing to the embargo, the strangling of Japan's economy, and the insult of dependence. Finally, the doctrine of southern expansion was chosen. Japan would move into Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. But all agreed, none of this was possible unless Pearl Harbor was destroyed. Japanese naval strategists said, "Our sword must strike first, before theirs is drawn." Meanwhile, American intelligence was not blind. Through the magic code-breaking program, U.S. cryptographers intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages. Hints appeared, but the full scope of Tokyo's intentions remained buried in secrecy. Only later would historians uncover memoranda stamped highly classified, documents revealing that Japan's leaders had already accepted war as inevitable, and that Pearl Harbor, was deliberately chosen as the spark to ignite the Pacific War. The decision was made, but the risk was monumental. Japan could not outbuild the United States. It could not match its industries or its fleets. Its only hope was secrecy, surprise, and speed. Within the walls of the Imperial Navy headquarters, a plan began to form. It was codenamed Operation Z, a strike that would change history forever. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the reluctant architect, pushed his staff relentlessly. He knew the odds, he knew the danger, and still, he believed in the shock of one decisive blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto said, "The fate of the empire depends on this single gamble. Success will buy us time, failure will destroy us completely." Naval engineers worked in silence, modifying aircraft carriers for the long journey. Pilots were trained in secret airfields, drilling torpedo attacks in shallow waters, a technique thought impossible. Classified memoranda from the Imperial Navy Air Bureau, marked top secret, later revealed the scale of innovation. Special torpedoes were built with wooden fins, designed to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow depths. What America thought was safe, Japan prepared to strike. Intelligence officers studied maps of Hawaii, charting every anchorage, every runway. Spy reports smuggled from Honolulu gave details of ship positions, patrol schedules, even weather patterns. Commander Minoru Genda said, "We must train for the impossible, to destroy a fleet in its own home waters." In the months before December 1941, secrecy ruled everything. Few outside the highest councils knew the full scope. Cabinet ministers spoke of diplomacy, while naval staff whispered of war. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the heart of the strike force, were assembled quietly. Supplies were hidden. Radio silence was enforced. The fleet prepared to vanish into the Pacific. A highly classified naval directive, discovered decades later in the Japanese war archives, made it clear. This was not merely a raid. It was the opening act of a total war. General Hideki Tojo said, "Our empire cannot breathe unless we break the chains America has wrapped around us." Even as Tokyo negotiated in Washington, messages carried through encrypted channels revealed the double game. U.S. intelligence intercepted fragments through the MAGIC program, but they did not yet see the full picture. Meanwhile, young pilots wrote letters home, sealed and never delivered. They believed they would strike a blow so great, it would change the course of the century. Every day of preparation, every plan hidden under the seal of top secret, brought Japan closer to the moment of no return. By late November 1941, the plan had left the drawing boards and become reality. 6 aircraft carriers, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, formed the most powerful naval strike force Japan had ever assembled. They gathered in the remote northern waters of Japan, far from prying eyes. The operation was wrapped in silence. Sailors told they were on training exercises. Officers warned never to utter the destination. On November 26, 1941, the fleet slipped from Hitokapu Bay in the Kurile Islands. Its course was set toward the vast emptiness of the North Pacific. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo said, "From this moment forward, every man must carry the weight of the empire upon his shoulders." Radio silence was absolute. No signals were sent. No lights were shown at night. Ships moved like ghosts through freezing seas. Even the crew did not know their true target until they were already at sea. American intelligence noticed movements in Southeast Asia, but no one imagined a massive carrier fleet steaming east toward Hawaii. Top-secret U.S. Navy Estimates focused on the Philippines or Malaya. Pearl Harbor was considered untouchable. The Japanese strike force cut a path across the Pacific, navigating storms, ice, and fog. It was a voyage planned with precision, guided by secrecy, protected by distance. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo said, "We sail into history, and perhaps into eternity." Meanwhile, in Washington, Japanese diplomats continued to meet with American officials. Ambassador Nomura presented proposals, while back home instructions arrived encrypted in the Purple Code. Magic intercepts caught fragments of these communications, but the meaning remained unclear. The storm was gathering, yet Washington did not see the lightning. On board the carriers, pilots studied maps of Oahu, memorizing the layout of Pearl Harbor, Wheeler Field, and Hickam Air Base. They practiced attack waves on paper, visualizing torpedoes skimming into battleships, bombs plunging into runways. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida said, "Every man here must know his duty, as if it were written into his blood." As the fleet pushed eastward, the tension grew. Cold winds swept across the decks. Ice formed on railings. But the silence of secrecy held firm. The sailors wrote final letters, some sealed in envelopes, others carved into diaries. They did not know if they would live to see their homeland again. A top-secret Imperial Navy order, declassified decades later, stated clearly, "No ship may return until its mission is fulfilled. Success is survival. Failure is unthinkable." On December 2, 1941, a coded message arrived from Tokyo. "Climb Mount Nietaka." This was the signal. War was to begin. The fleet pressed on, undetected, unnoticed, unstoppable. Ahead lay the Hawaiian Islands, and a Sunday morning that would change the world. Dawn broke quietly over Oahu. The sun rose above Diamond Head, casting golden light over calm waters. Sailors aboard the U.S. Pacific Fleet prepared for what they thought was just another peaceful Sunday. On Ford Island, bands rehearsed for morning concerts. On the decks of battleships, flags were raised, and chaplains prepared for church services. It was a day of rest, routine, and ordinary duty. Far to the north, 6 Japanese carriers turned into the wind. Engines roared, decks trembled, and the first wave of aircraft lined up for launch. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida said, "Today we write history. Let us strike with all our strength, all our strength." At 6:20 a.m., the first planes lifted from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and the others. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters filled the cold sky. They formed into attack waves and pointed south toward Pearl Harbor. Back at the base, radar operators picked up strange blips approaching Oahu. But they were dismissed as American bombers expected from California. The warning never reached commanders in time. At 7:49 a.m., as the Hawaiian morning grew bright, Fuchida signaled to his men. The code words echoed across radios. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida said, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The message meant complete surprise had been achieved. Below, the battleships of the U.S. fleet lay motionless, unaware of the storm about to fall upon them. The first torpedo bombers skimmed low across the harbor, releasing their deadly weapons. At 7:55 a.m., explosions ripped through the calm. The battleship USS Oklahoma shuddered, capsized within minutes, hundreds trapped inside. A U.S. sailor later said, "The ship turned over, and the screams of my friends echoed in the darkness." The USS West Virginia and USS California were struck and began sinking. Flames roared across decks. Smoke boiled into the sky. The heart of America's Pacific Fleet was under attack. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, releasing bombs upon Wheeler Field and Hickam Air Base. Hangars exploded, planes burst into flames, trapped on the ground before they could take off. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel said, "It was as if hell itself had opened over Pearl Harbor." Kimmel said, "It was as if hell itself had opened over Pearl Harbor." Within minutes, the harbor was a scene of chaos. Battleships listed, sailors leapt into burning oil-slicked waters. The pride of the fleet, the USS Arizona, took a direct hit. At 8:06 a.m., a massive armor-piercing bomb plunged through her deck. It ignited the forward magazine, setting off a cataclysmic explosion. The Arizona erupted in fire and steel. Over 1,000 men killed instantly. A survivor from USS Arizona said, "We never had a chance. One moment we stood at attention. The next, the world vanished in fire." Across Oahu, civilians stared in shock as black smoke rose into the sky. Families rushed into shelters, believing invasion was coming. For the first time, war had arrived on American soil. And at Pearl Harbor, Sunday morning, peace had turned into America's darkest hour. While smoke still rose from the first strikes, the second wave of Japanese aircraft swept in over Oahu. This wave, launched an hour after the first, numbered over 160 planes. Dive bombers, high-level bombers, and fighters. Their orders were clear: finish what the first wave began. Target airfields, destroy remaining planes, and cripple any ships still afloat. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki said, "Strike without hesitation. The enemy must not rise again." At Hickam Field, chaos reigned. Hangars already burning were struck again. Fuel tanks exploded into rolling fireballs. American ground crews fought desperately with rifles against the sky. But the storm above was merciless. At Kaneohe and Wheeler, rows of P-40 fighters were destroyed where they sat, their wings shattering in flames. Pilots who tried to take off were gunned down before their wheels left the runway. A U.S. pilot recalled, "We never got airborne. They slaughtered us on the ground." On the waters of Pearl Harbor, the second wave sought out any remaining strength. The battleship USS Nevada attempted to escape, engines pounding, moving toward the open sea. But she became the lone target of dozens of attackers. Bombs struck her decks, torpedoes tore her hull, and she ran aground in shallow water, smoke pouring from her wounds. The Nevada's sacrifice prevented her from blocking the harbor entrance. A survivor from USS Nevada said, "We fought to keep her moving, but she bled too much. We had to beach her or lose everything." Other ships took hits: the cruisers Helena and Raleigh, the destroyer Cassine, torn and twisted by explosions. Everywhere, fireboats and tugs fought desperately to control infernos. American anti-aircraft gunners, stunned at first, now filled the sky with steel. Machine guns rattled, 5-inch guns thundered. Japanese planes began to fall from the sky in flames. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo said, in his after-action notes, the second wave faced greater resistance. Surprise was no longer ours. Yet the destruction was devastating. By 9:30 a.m., 2 waves had left Pearl Harbor in ruins. Over 180 American aircraft destroyed, 8 battleships sunk or crippled, thousands dead or wounded. But even in ruin, some targets remained untouched. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. They were still at sea, and they would become the heart of America's counterattack. General George C. Marshall said, later in Washington, "The Japanese have awakened a giant and filled him with terrible resolve." The second wave turned north, heading back to the carriers. The mission was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The attack was over, but its echoes spread like wildfire. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. Black smoke rose into the Hawaiian sky. and the United States was changed forever in a single morning. Black smoke rose into the Hawaiian sky, and the United States was changed forever in a single morning. On the decks of shattered battleships, survivors searched for comrades. Some pulled bodies from oil-covered waters. Others dug through twisted steel with bare hands. The smell of burning fuel and flesh hung heavy across the harbor. A survivor from USS Arizona said, "We searched the wreckage, but most of our brothers never came out." By noon, the fires still raged. Medical teams worked frantically, hospitals overflowing with wounded sailors. Churches opened their doors as makeshift wards. Volunteers carried the injured on stretchers made of doors and planks. The numbers were staggering. Over 2,400 Americans killed, more than 1,000 wounded, nearly the entire battleship force destroyed or crippled. And yet, 3 American aircraft carriers had escaped destruction, a fact that would soon reshape the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, in his notes that day, "The hand that struck Pearl Harbor has delivered a blow at freedom itself." Across the Pacific, Japan celebrated. Radio Tokyo announced a glorious victory, calling it the Day of Destiny. But in Washington, the reaction was shock, disbelief, and then resolve. At the White House, stunned officials gathered around the president. Telegram after telegram arrived, confirming the scale of the disaster. The Pacific Fleet was crippled, but America's spirit was not. Admiral Harold Stark said, "We are in the war now. There is no turning back." Secret intelligence files declassified decades later revealed just how much confusion clouded the hours after the attack. Reports spoke of submarines off the coast, of a possible invasion of Hawaii, of Japanese fleets striking the Philippines next. The uncertainty was overwhelming, but one fact was clear: America was now at war. The strike on Pearl Harbor was not only against ships and planes, it was against an entire nation's pride. The following day, December 8, 1941, Congress assembled. Citizens across America listened by radio as their president addressed them. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." WWII. The words echoed across the nation. Factories would soon roar to life. Young men would line up to enlist. And the United States, once hesitant, now stood united. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill heard the news in London. He understood instantly what it meant. Prime Minister Winston Churchill said, "So we had won after all. America was in the war, up to the neck and to the death." In Tokyo, Japanese leaders believed they had secured their empire's future. But in truth, they had awakened a force far greater than they imagined. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack. It was the spark that ignited a global fire. Pearl Harbor was more than a battle. It was a turning point of destiny. In a single morning, America's isolation ended, and a world war entered its deadliest phase. The losses were immense, but they forged something greater. Factories that once built cars now forged tanks and planes. Young men rushed to recruiting stations, and a divided nation became united in purpose. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "No matter how long it may take us, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory." In Tokyo, leaders rejoiced at their triumph, believing they had crippled their greatest enemy. But within 6 months, their gamble began to unravel. At Midway, the tide turned, and the empire that struck Pearl Harbor began to fall back step by step. For the sailors who survived, the memory never left. The screams, the fire, the smoke rising from the water. These images haunted them for the rest of their lives. A survivor said years later, "Every December, I can still smell the burning oil. I can still hear the cries of the men we could not save." Pearl Harbor entered history books, speeches, films, monuments of stone and steel. But more than that, it became a lesson, a warning across generations. That complacency is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, and that the cost of unpreparedness can be measured in blood. Prime Minister Winston Churchill said, "In one stroke, the Japanese accomplished what we had sought for many months. They united America against them." From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a force that would defeat fascism and militarism across two oceans. But it also marked the beginning of a new age, an age of total war, of global strategy, of weapons beyond imagination. The classified files, the secret cables, the memories of those who were there, all tell the same story. Pearl Harbor was not only an attack, it was a door that opened onto a new world. And now, the question remains, was Pearl Harbor the day that saved the future by bringing America into the fight? Or was it the day that set humanity on the path toward even greater destruction?